The morning mist hung heavy over Wigan's industrial landscape when the first whispers began to spread through the narrow streets. What started as a routine council meeting about waste management would soon explode into a controversy that would reach the very heart of the British monarchy. In a town where loyalty to the crown had never wavered, residents found themselves asking an unthinkable question. Had their beloved king let them down? The smell was unmistakable that Tuesday morning in March. Mrs. Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old grandmother who had lived on Pemberton Road her entire life, stepped outside to collect her morning paper and was hit by a wave of putrid air that made her stomach turn. The waste facility that had promised to bring jobs and prosperity to their community had instead brought something far more sinister. As Russell Myers, the royal correspondent who had covered the monarchy for over 2 decades, prepared to release his final extract on the unfolding scandal, the people of Wigan waited with bated breath. What they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about royal involvement in local affairs, corporate responsibility, and the true cost of progress in modern Britain. The trouble began 6 months earlier when Crown Estate Holdings, a company with indirect ties to royal investments, announced plans to develop a state-of-the-art waste processing facility in Wigan. The project promised to create 300 jobs in a town that desperately needed economic revival after years of industrial decline. Local MP Sarah Whitfield had championed the initiative, describing it as a golden opportunity for her constituents. King Charles himself had made a brief visit to Wigan during the planning phase, touring the proposed site and meeting with local officials. The photographs from that day showed the monarch in his element, discussing environmental sustainability and the importance of responsible waste management. He spoke passionately about turning waste into energy, creating a circular economy that would benefit both the environment and the local community. This facility represents the future, the king had said during his visit, his words carefully documented by the local press. We must embrace innovation while respecting our communities and our planet. The residents of Wigan had been charmed by their royal visitor, and many saw his endorsement as a seal of approval for the controversial project. Margaret Thompson had been among the crowd that day, waving a small Union Jack flag as the king walked past. She remembered feeling proud that her little corner of Lancashire was being recognised by the crown. Her neighbour, John Davies, a former coal miner who had been unemployed for 3 years, saw the facility as his ticket back to steady work and dignity. The planning permission process moved with unusual speed. Environmental assessments were fast-tracked, and concerns raised by a small group of local activists were quickly dismissed. Dr. Emma Richardson, an environmental scientist from nearby Manchester University, had submitted a detailed report questioning the facility's proposed location near residential areas and a primary school. Her warnings about potential air quality issues and groundwater contamination were noted but not acted upon. Councillor Michael Roberts, who had initially supported the project, began to have doubts when he noticed discrepancies in the environmental impact studies. The waste facility was being built closer to homes than originally planned, and the types of waste it would process had expanded beyond what was first proposed. When he raised these concerns at council meetings, he was told that any delays would risk losing the royal backing and the associated investment. Construction began in earnest during the autumn months. The site buzzed with activity as lorries delivered materials and workers laid foundations for what would become one of the largest waste processing facilities in the northwest. Local businesses benefited from the influx of construction workers, and there was a genuine sense of optimism in the air. The king's environmental advisors visited the site regularly, ensuring that the facility would meet the highest standards for sustainable waste management. However, as winter approached, strange things began to happen. Residents living near the construction site reported unusual odors, particularly in the early morning hours. At first, these were dismissed as typical construction smells, but as the facility neared completion, the odors became stronger and more frequent. Margaret Thompson found herself closing her windows at night, something she had never done in 40 years of living in the same house. The facility officially opened in February with great fanfare. Local dignitaries cut ribbons, speeches were made about environmental progress, and the first trucks began delivering waste for processing. The king sent a congratulatory message, praising the facility as an example of how traditional industrial communities could adapt to the challenges of the 21st century. But within days of full operation, the reality on the ground was very different from the glossy brochures and royal endorsements. The smell that had been intermittent during construction became constant and overwhelming. Children at nearby Pemberton Primary School began complaining of headaches and nausea. Parents kept their windows closed even on warm spring days, and hanging laundry outside became impossible. Dr. Richardson, who had been monitoring air quality readings from her university laboratory, noticed alarming spikes in particulate matter and volatile organic compounds around the facility. Her attempts to share this data with local authorities were met with bureaucratic delays and requests for additional verification. Meanwhile, the health complaints from residents continued to mount. John Davies, who had finally found work at the facility, began to notice that many of his colleagues were falling ill. Respiratory problems were common, and several workers had taken extended sick leave. When he raised concerns with management, he was told that all safety protocols were being followed and that any health issues were likely coincidental. The local press initially gave the facility positive coverage, focusing on the jobs it had created and the environmental benefits of modern waste processing. However, as resident complaints increased, some journalists began to ask more probing questions. The facility's parent company proved reluctant to provide detailed information about the types of waste being processed or the specific technologies being used. Margaret Thompson decided to start keeping a diary of the smells and their intensity. She noted that the worst odors seemed to occur during the night shift, when fewer people were around to witness them. Her detailed records would later prove crucial in documenting the pattern of environmental violations that were occurring at the facility. As spring turned to early summer, the situation deteriorated further. Children at the primary school were frequently sent home sick, and several elderly residents sought medical treatment for respiratory problems. Dr. Sarah Collins, a local GP, noticed a significant increase in patients presenting with symptoms that could be linked to poor air quality. The turning point came when Russell Myers, the respected royal correspondent, received a tip from a source close to the royal household. The source suggested that there had been concerns about the Wigan facility for months, but that these concerns had been suppressed to avoid embarrassing the king, who had so publicly endorsed the project. Myers began his investigation quietly, speaking to residents, reviewing planning documents, and analyzing the financial connections between Crown Estate Holdings and the facility's operators. What he discovered was a web of corporate relationships that made the royal family's involvement more complex and potentially more damaging than anyone had realized. The correspondent's preliminary findings suggested that while the king had genuinely believed in the project's environmental benefits, he had been given incomplete information about the facility's operations. The types of waste being processed were more toxic than originally disclosed, and the emission control systems were not functioning as designed. As Myers prepared to publish his first extract, the residents of Wigan were about to learn that their local environmental disaster had implications that reached far beyond their small community. The king's reputation for environmental stewardship was about to face its most serious challenge, and the people who had welcomed him so warmly were beginning to feel betrayed by the very institution they had always trusted. Margaret Thompson still kept her Union Jack flag in the kitchen drawer, but she no longer looked at it with the same pride she had felt on that sunny day when the king visited their town. The promise of progress had turned into a nightmare of pollution and broken trust, and the questions being asked in Wigan were about to reverberate through the corridors of power in London. Russell Myers spent weeks in Wigan documenting the growing crisis that had engulfed the town. His investigation revealed layers of corporate complexity that made tracing responsibility increasingly difficult. Crown Estate Holdings had subcontracted the facility's operations to Green Tech Solutions, which in turn had partnerships with several waste management companies across Europe. Each layer of corporate structure seemed designed to distance the ultimate decision-makers from the consequences of their choices. The journalist's breakthrough came when he obtained internal emails from a whistleblower inside Green Tech Solutions. The messages, dated just 2 weeks after the facility became operational, showed clear awareness of emission control failures. Senior managers had discussed the problems in detail, calculating the cost of repairs against the likelihood of regulatory action. The chilling conclusion was that it would be cheaper to pay potential fines than to fix the underlying problems. Margaret Thompson had become an unofficial spokesperson for the affected residents. Her kitchen table served as headquarters for a growing campaign group that called itself Wigan Breathes. She organized petition drives, coordinated with other affected neighborhoods, and maintained meticulous records of health complaints and environmental incidents. Her gentle determination and articulate presentation of the facts made her an effective advocate for her community. The health impacts were becoming impossible to ignore. Dr. Sarah Collins had treated over 200 patients for respiratory complaints since the facility opened, a number that represented nearly 15% of her practice. She began documenting cases systematically, noting patterns in symptoms and their correlation with wind direction and weather conditions that affected air quality around the facility. Children were particularly vulnerable. Pemberton Primary School reported that attendance had dropped by 20% as parents kept their children home on days when the air quality was especially poor. The school's head teacher, Mrs. Janet Morrison, wrote to the local council describing how children were unable to play outside during break times and how several pupils had developed persistent coughs that seemed to worsen when they were at school. John Davies continued working at the facility despite his growing concerns about his own health and that of his colleagues. He had started wearing his own respiratory protection after noticing that the company-issued masks seemed inadequate. Several of his co-workers had developed what they called facility lung, a persistent irritation that made breathing difficult, especially during physical exertion. The financial pressures on the facility were becoming apparent as well. Green Tech Solutions had borrowed heavily to fund the construction, and the loan agreements required the facility to process minimum amounts of waste to remain profitable. This created perverse incentives to accept more toxic materials than the facility was designed to handle, pushing the emission control systems beyond their operational limits. Myers discovered that the King's environmental advisors had flagged concerns about the facility's operations as early as March, just weeks after it opened. A confidential report prepared for the royal household detailed emission exceedances and recommended immediate intervention. However, this report had been buried in bureaucratic processes, with palace officials apparently reluctant to embarrass the King by admitting that his endorsed project was failing. The local political response was initially defensive. Councillor Michael Roberts, who had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of the facility, found himself isolated within the council chamber. His colleagues, many of whom had staked their reputations on the facility's success, were reluctant to admit that they had made a mistake. The prospect of having to answer for misleading their constituents and ignoring expert warnings made honest assessment of the situation politically dangerous. Sarah Whitfield, the local MP, faced the most difficult position of all. She had been instrumental in securing the facility for Wigan and had frequently cited the King's support when defending the project in Parliament. Her political career had been built on bringing investment to her constituency, and the Wigan facility represented her most significant achievement. Admitting failure would likely end her prospects for advancement within her party. The environmental monitoring data, when it finally became public through Freedom of Information requests, painted a stark picture. Particulate matter levels exceeded recommended guidelines on over 60% of days since the facility opened. Volatile organic compounds, some of which were known carcinogens, were being detected at levels that posed serious long-term health risks to nearby residents. Dr. Emma Richardson, whose early warnings had been ignored, found herself vindicated but took no satisfaction in being proved right. Her worst predictions about air quality had been exceeded, and her concerns about groundwater contamination were beginning to materialize. Well water in several homes near the facility showed elevated levels of heavy metals and organic pollutants. The facility's parent companies began a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to shift blame and minimize their legal exposure. They commissioned their own studies that questioned the health impacts and suggested that resident complaints were psychosomatic responses to negative media coverage. They emphasized the jobs created and the facility's theoretical environmental benefits, while downplaying the operational failures that had made those benefits impossible to achieve. Myers received additional leaked documents that showed how the facility's design had been compromised during construction. Cost-cutting measures had led to the installation of cheaper emission control equipment that was insufficient for the types of waste being processed. The facility's operators knew this, but calculated that the regulatory response would be slow and the penalties manageable. The human cost of these corporate calculations was becoming tragically clear. Elderly residents with pre-existing respiratory conditions found their health deteriorating rapidly. Mrs. Dorothy Wilson, an 84-year-old woman who lived just 3 streets from the facility, was hospitalized twice with severe breathing difficulties that her doctors directly attributed to poor air quality. Margaret Thompson's diary had grown into a comprehensive record of environmental violations that would later prove crucial in legal proceedings. She noted not just the presence of odors, but their intensity, duration, and correlation with weather patterns. Her scientific approach to documentation impressed lawyers who would eventually represent the community in their fight for compensation and remediation. The pressure on the royal household was mounting as Myers prepared his second extract. Palace sources speaking anonymously expressed frustration with the situation and suggested that the King felt personally betrayed by the corporate mismanagement of a project he had supported in good faith. However, critics argued that royal endorsements should come with better due diligence and ongoing oversight. The financial implications were staggering. Property values near the facility had plummeted as prospective buyers avoided the area. Local businesses reported significant losses as customers stayed away from the affected neighborhoods. The economic benefits that had been promised to justify the facility's approval were being overwhelmed by the costs of its environmental and health impacts. John Davies made the difficult decision to quit his job at the facility after several of his colleagues developed serious respiratory illnesses. The income had been desperately needed, but he could no longer justify working in conditions that he believed were dangerous to his health and that of his co-workers. His departure removed one of the few sources of inside information about the facility's operations. As summer progressed, the situation in Wigan became a national story. Environmental groups seized on the case as an example of corporate irresponsibility and regulatory failure. The King's involvement added a dimension that elevated the story beyond a typical industrial accident, making it a test case for royal accountability in an era of increasing environmental awareness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the Wigan facility, but also the future of royal involvement in commercial projects. Myers had gathered enough evidence to support serious questions about whether the King and his advisors had done enough to prevent a disaster that many had seen coming. The final extract of his investigation would reveal whether those in power had learned from their mistakes or would continue to prioritize public relations over public health. Russell Myers was putting the finishing touches on his final extract when he received a call that would change everything. The whistleblower who had provided the internal emails from Green Tech Solutions wanted to meet in person. The source, a senior engineer named David Martinez who had worked on emission control systems for over 20 years, was ready to go on the record with information that would expose the full extent of the corporate cover-up. Martinez revealed that the problems at the Wigan facility were not accidental failures but deliberate cost-cutting decisions made at the highest levels of the company. The emission control systems had been designed to handle standard municipal waste, but the facility had been secretly processing industrial chemicals and medical waste that required much more sophisticated treatment. The additional revenue from these high-value waste streams had been too tempting to resist. The engineer provided detailed technical documentation showing that company executives had known for months that their facility was operating outside safe parameters. Internal memos discussed the risk of regulatory attention and the need to manage public perception rather than addressing the underlying safety issues. Martinez had been pressured to sign off on operating procedures that he believed were dangerous, and his refusal to do so had led to his dismissal. Margaret Thompson received news that would galvanize the entire community. Her granddaughter Emma, a bright 8-year-old who attended Pemberton Primary School, had been diagnosed with severe asthma that doctors directly linked to air quality exposure. The little girl who had once loved playing in her grandmother's garden now needed daily medication and could no longer participate in outdoor activities with her friends. The diagnosis was the final straw for many residents who had been hoping the situation would improve naturally. Emma's condition provided a human face for the abstract discussions of emission levels and health statistics. The image of a child using an inhaler because of corporate negligence crystallized the moral urgency of the situation in ways that technical reports could not. Sarah Collins organized a comprehensive health survey of the affected area, working with epidemiologists from Manchester University to establish clear statistical links between facility emissions and health outcomes. The results were damning. Respiratory illness rates in the area immediately surrounding the facility were nearly 4 times higher than the regional average, with children and elderly residents showing the most severe impacts. The survey revealed additional health effects that had not been previously documented. Residents reported increased rates of headaches, sleep disturbances, and skin irritation. Several pregnant women in the area had experienced complications, though establishing direct causation remained challenging. The cumulative health burden was far greater than anyone had initially realized. John Davies had found new employment at a manufacturing plant in nearby Bolton, but his experience at the waste facility had left him with permanent lung damage. Medical tests showed scarring that his doctors attributed to prolonged exposure to industrial chemicals. His case became a template for other former workers seeking compensation for occupational health impacts. The legal response began to materialize as affected residents organized class action lawsuits against both Green Tech Solutions and Crown Estate Holdings. The royal connection made these cases particularly complex, as lawyers had to navigate constitutional questions about the monarchy's legal liability for commercial activities conducted by associated entities. Meyer's investigation had uncovered a pattern of regulatory capture that explained how the facility had been approved despite obvious problems. Several local officials had financial interests in companies that benefited from the facility's construction, creating conflicts of interest that had never been properly disclosed. The planning permission process had been compromised from the beginning. The king's private reaction to the unfolding scandal, according to palace sources, was one of genuine dismay and anger. He had been passionate about environmental issues throughout his life and felt personally betrayed by the corporate mismanagement of a project he had supported. However, his public response was constrained by constitutional limitations on royal involvement in commercial disputes. Palace officials began quietly distancing the monarch from the project, emphasizing that his support had been based on representations about environmental benefits that had proved to be false. They pointed out that the king had no direct financial interest in the facility and had been misled about its operations just as the residents of Wigan had been. The environmental remediation required to address the facility's impacts would cost millions of pounds and take years to complete. Soil contamination around the site was more extensive than initially realized, and groundwater pollution had spread beyond the facility's boundaries. Several residential wells had been permanently contaminated and would need to be replaced with municipal water connections. Councillor Michael Roberts, who had become a vocal critic of the facility, decided to run for mayor on a platform of environmental protection and corporate accountability. His campaign highlighted the failures of local government to protect residents' interests and promised a new approach to industrial development that would prioritize community health over corporate profits. The political ramifications extended far beyond Wigan. Environmental groups used the case to argue for stricter oversight of royal endorsements of commercial projects, suggesting that the monarchy's environmental credibility was at stake. Critics questioned whether the king's passion for environmental causes had been exploited by corporate interests seeking to greenwash their operations. Sarah Whitfield, the local MP, faced a difficult choice between defending her past support for the facility and acknowledging the harm it had caused to her constituents. Her political future depended on how effectively she could position herself as an advocate for affected residents, rather than a supporter of the corporate interests that had misled everyone involved. The financial costs of the disaster continued to mount. Greentech Solutions filed for bankruptcy protection, leaving questions about who would pay for the necessary cleanup and resident compensation. Crown Estate Holdings maintained that it had been a passive investor with no operational control, but legal challenges to this position were pending in multiple courts. Margaret Thompson had become a reluctant celebrity, appearing on national television and radio programs to discuss the Wigan situation. Her articulate presentation of the facts and her obvious sincerity made her an effective spokesperson for the broader issues of corporate accountability and environmental justice that the case represented. The final extract of Meyer's investigation revealed the most damaging information yet. Internal communications showing that Royal Environmental Advisors had recommended withdrawing support for the facility as early as April, but that this recommendation had been overruled by palace officials concerned about the political implications of such an action. The documents suggested that protecting the king's reputation had taken priority over protecting the health of Wigan residents. This revelation transformed the story from one about corporate malfeasance to one about institutional failure at the highest levels of British society. Emma Thompson's condition gradually improved after her family relocated to a neighbourhood with better air quality, but the experience had changed her permanently. The confident, outgoing child had become anxious and fearful, requiring counselling to help her cope with the health crisis that had disrupted her young life. The Wigan waste facility was finally shut down after 6 months of operation, but the damage to the community would last for generations. The promised jobs disappeared, the environmental contamination remained, and trust in institutions had been severely eroded. The king's reputation for environmental leadership had been tarnished, perhaps permanently. As Russell Myers published his final extract, the question facing Britain was whether the lessons of Wigan would lead to meaningful reforms or would be forgotten as attention moved to other scandals. The residents of the town that had welcomed their king with such enthusiasm now faced an uncertain future, wondering whether justice would ever be served and whether their community would ever fully recover from the promises that were broken in their name.